Black woman faces brutality from cops. Then her Secret Service team arrives. Brielle Carter had never imagined her evening stroll through the buzzing heart of Washington, D.C. would turn into a life-altering nightmare. The glow of street lamps guided her from the National Mall toward the next bustling avenue as the faint echoes of distant chatter and car horns created a symphony of city life. But before she could even process the shift, blue and red lights flickered onto the sidewalk, slicing through the night. What happened next would shake her to her core, an encounter with officers that spiraled beyond logic. Little did anyone suspect that Brielle was not just any woman. She had formidable connections with the United States Secret Service. Brielle Carter closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the humid August air. Work at the non-profit headquarters near Capitol Hill had drained every ounce of her energy that day. As an intern coordinator for a prominent civil rights organization, she spent hours juggling meeting agendas, supervising volunteers, and drafting reports on the latest legislative efforts. She took pride in her role. She was fighting for equality, standing on the shoulders of giants, continuing a legacy of brave men and women who believed in transformative justice. Her mother used to say that one could change the world one compassionate act at a time. Brielle believed that deeply. She walked along Constitution Avenue, comforted by the silhouette of the Washington Monument in the distance. Bright white lights casting an elegant glow against the night sky. Her mind buzzed with upcoming tasks, preparing for a congressional hearing next week on criminal justice reform, finalizing policy briefings, and overseeing volunteers for the next wave of grassroots campaigns. Despite her exhaustion, she felt the warm surge of purpose in her veins. As she passed the National Museum of African American History and Culture, she decided she would take a detour through a quieter street. She veered onto a less crowded path, where the city's nightlife vibe gradually receded into a stillness broken only by passing cars and muffled music from a nearby restaurant. She glanced at her watch, nearly 9:30. Just then, headlights beamed from behind, gliding up the road. A patrol car from the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Department. She thought nothing of it at first. These streets teemed with law enforcement vehicles, especially near government buildings. But instead of rolling by, the cruiser slowed, its window lowering. A male officer's face emerged. She couldn't hear what he said, so she stepped closer to the curb. "You," the officer barked, "step over here for a minute." Instantly, a prickle of anxiety sizzled in her chest. She had done nothing wrong. She was simply walking. Swallowing that first wave of nervousness, Brielle approached the curb. The officer's tone was sharp, suspicious, like she was an intruder in her own city. "Yes?" Brielle asked, her voice steady. She had dealt with cops before during demonstrations, had known some decent ones who believed in community policing. But she was also acutely aware of how quickly situations could escalate for Black women. "You live in the area?" the officer demanded. He had an angular face, the brim of his hat casting a dark shadow across tense eyes. "Not in this immediate neighborhood," Brielle replied. "I'm walking to meet a friend." The officer scowled. "Can I see some ID?" Her heart thumped. This area wasn't restricted. It wasn't a checkpoint. There was no curfew. And yet, from the stories she heard throughout her life, she knew compliance often served as the safest route. She pulled out her wallet slowly, offering her driver's license. The officer's gaze dipped to her name, then back up, as though searching for an excuse. He mumbled something under his breath, then returned her ID. "This area's been having break-ins. We've got an alert out for suspicious activity." Brielle felt her shoulders tense. "I'm sorry to hear that, but I'm just heading. Keep your hands where I can see them," the officer commanded. For a moment, confusion and frustration mingled on her face. Did he really think she was a suspect? Before she could respond, another patrol car pulled up, lights flashing. Two more officers stepped out, posture rigid, eyes scanning the scene. She watched them approach, each step saturated with tension. Something felt off. Why this intensity for a simple ID check? Got a call about suspicious loitering, one of them said, voice devoid of emotion. Fear flickered inside Brielle. She was not loitering. She was walking home. How had it escalated to suspicious loitering so quickly? She was about to speak when the first officer snatched her by the arm, more forcefully than necessary. The shock of it left her momentarily speechless. "Excuse me, what are you doing?" she managed, trying to keep her composure. "No sudden moves," one of the newcomers snarled. "We've had enough trouble around here." From somewhere inside, an acute sense of injustice roared. But her rational mind screamed caution. "I'm not resisting," she said calmly, though her voice trembled. "I haven't done anything wrong." One of the other officers took a step closer, eyes scanning her from head to toe. Brielle's heart hammered. She felt small, cornered, every nerve alive with dread. That was when it dawned on her this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern, and she was caught in it. Despite having all the right credentials, despite being a law-abiding citizen, despite working every day to safeguard civil rights. In that moment, she had never felt more powerless. What she didn't know yet, what nobody there would have guessed, was that this chance encounter would set in motion a series of events that would shake up not just her life, but the entire law enforcement precinct. Because Brielle was not alone in this city. High-ranking individuals cared deeply about her well-being. And soon, the chain of command that protected her would descend upon these streets like a thunderstorm. At first, Brielle hoped the officers would relent once they verified her identity. She had no criminal history. She had a clean record. She had never even received a parking ticket. But the first officer gripped her arm like she was a flight risk. A second demanded to see what was in her bag. She swallowed her protest, inhaling a shaky breath. She wanted to get through this safely. The third officer circled behind her, speaking into a radio. "We've got a potential suspect, matching the description, female, African American, early 20s, he said. "We'll bring her in for questioning." Brielle stiffened. "Wait. What description? Who made this report? I'm just walking." Her protest was cut short by the first officer yanking her arm behind her back. Pain jolted up to her shoulder. She gasped. Her eyes darted around, searching for any witnesses. A nearby couple stared from across the street, but they looked frightened or confused. No one intervened. "Stop resisting," the officer snapped. "I'm not resisting," Brielle cried, voice cracking. Her legs trembled. She worried that any sudden movement might provoke them further. She had read too many stories, watched too many videos. Her mind sparked with possible outcomes, each more terrifying than the last. Tension buzzed in the air like electricity. The second officer rummaged through her shoulder bag without any semblance of courtesy, hurling out her phone, a small notepad, a couple of lip balms. Then he froze, hand clutching at a small ID wallet that bore an emblem of the White House. Brielle's heart pounded as she realized what they had discovered. Though she didn't work at the White House, she had a certain level of clearance due to her volunteer collaborations with a White House advisory panel on civil rights. That volunteer work had granted her an official pass, updated monthly. It wasn't top-level clearance by any means, but it was recognized in certain circles. The officer stared at the card. His face twitched, as if he were trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "Where'd you get this?" he growled. "This is fake, right?" She bit back her anger. "It's not fake. I work with an official group that consults with White House staff." A faint flicker of confusion lit the officer's eyes. They hadn't expected that. One of them took the card, stepped away to radio someone for a verification check, presumably. Meanwhile, Brielle felt the sting of plastic handcuffs biting into her wrists. They had pinned her arms behind her back with a force that bordered on cruelty. "You're coming with us," the first officer announced, even before the verification came through. "Please," she said, hearing her voice shake, "I haven't done anything. You'll see my pass is real." A silent war seemed to wage among the officers. The two who arrived later glanced at each other, as though trying to gauge if they had overstepped. But the first officer, the one who had initiated everything, looked resolute, determined to see this through. Perhaps he didn't want to lose face in front of his colleagues. "Get in the car," he ordered. Brielle tried to steady her breathing. She felt her mind teetering between panic and an odd sense of detachment, like she was watching this happen to someone else. She had volunteered at countless legal aid clinics. She knew all about the labyrinth of systemic injustice. But now she was trapped in the very system she had fought against. An unexpected wave of defiance surged through her. She had to make a phone call. She had rights. Yet every time she tried to speak, the officer barked at her to stay silent. They shoved her into the back of a squad car, her forehead nearly banging against the steel mesh partition. As the car pulled away from the curb, she locked eyes with the couple still standing on the sidewalk. Their faces were etched with horror, but they seemed helpless. Meanwhile, the city lights blurred outside the window. Inside the car, her heart hammered, her wrists stinging from the cuffs. She wondered who might come to her defense. Her best friend, Tasha, was out of town. Her immediate family lived in Chicago. Could she call her boss at the nonprofit? Would he be able to mobilize help quickly? Little did Brielle know that this situation was about to attract the attention of a far more powerful ally. Because the White House pass in her bag wasn't just any pass, it had been personally authorized by one of the president's closest advisors on civil rights. That advisor, a long-time mentor to Brielle, would soon light up phone lines across Washington the moment she heard that Brielle had gone missing under suspicious circumstances. And if that wasn't enough, there was someone who had entrusted Brielle with a vow of protection, a vow that would soon bring men and women in black suits with earpieces to the police precinct doors, demanding answers. Brielle Carter was more connected than she realized, and the consequences of this arrest would reverberate far beyond a single police station. The station was every bit as stark and claustrophobic as one might expect: buzzing fluorescent lights, institutional grey walls, scuffed linoleum floors. Brielle was roughly ushered in through a side door leading into a small windowless intake area. She cringed as she felt the handcuffs dig deeper into her wrists. Her mind churned with confusion, fear, and a simmering anger that threatened to boil over. An officer behind a desk, bored and bleary-eyed, looked up. "Another suspect?" he asked. No hint of irony or pity in his tone. "Potential suspect," corrected the first officer who had arrested Brielle. "Loitering, possible connection to recent break-ins. Plus, she's carrying suspicious credentials. Need her printed and processed," the lead officer continued. Brielle's heart hammered as they marched her over to a fingerprint station. She tried to hold back tears. She didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing her afraid. This was beyond humiliating. This was a violation. Her hands trembled. She closed her eyes, remembering all the stories told by activists who had been in her place. The fight for justice wasn't just words on paper. It was this raw, painful, messy reality. "You have the right to remain silent," droned another officer, reading her the Miranda rights with the kind of mechanical monotony that suggested he did this a dozen times a day. "Anything you say can and will be used against you." Brielle exhaled shakily. How did it come to this? Every part of her yearned to scream, to protest, but that seed of caution remained. Don't resist. Don't talk back. Stay calm. You'll get your chance. Once the routine was done, They placed her in a holding cell with three other women. Two were young, reeking of alcohol, and one older, quiet, hugging her knees in the corner. The cell bars clanged shut behind her. She stood near the bars, wanting to distance herself from the clamor. She needed to think, to plan her next move. But as she glanced at the grimy floors and the flickering overhead light, her courage flagged. This was a place where hope felt distant. Time blurred. She wasn't sure how many minutes or hours passed. She asked for her phone call, but an officer told her she'd have to wait until after initial processing. She tried to demand a lawyer, but her pleas fell on disinterested ears. Suddenly, a commotion stirred in the hallway. Raised voices, radio chatter, footsteps echoing down the corridor. Brielle tensed, her heart fluttering with apprehension. She ventured closer to the bars, craning her neck to see what was happening. "Step aside," boomed a new voice. It carried an air of authority. She caught a glimpse of tailored black suits, crisp white shirts, shiny shoes, earpieces coiled behind their ears like serpents. "What's this about?" barked the desk officer, sounding alarmed. One of the men in black suits held up a badge. "Special Agent Coleman, USSECRET Service. We have reason to believe you're holding Miss Brielle Carter." The entire corridor fell silent. The police officers behind the desk exchanged looks. Their faces went pale. Brielle felt a rush of adrenaline. They'd come. She hadn't even managed to call anyone yet, but word had gotten out. She was both relieved and absolutely baffled. Why the Secret Service? She knew people in high places, but this level of response was surreal. "Secret Service? That's not possible," sputtered the lead officer, stepping forward. Special Agent Coleman's gaze was unyielding. "We have high-level clearance. Miss Carter is directly connected to an ongoing civil rights advisory initiative under White House oversight. She's also under protective watch for reasons you don't need to know." He flicked his wrist toward the corridor. "Stand aside. We're retrieving her now." Another agent stepped up, equally imposing. "Where is she?" Brielle could hear the tension in the air, like a live wire. She watched as the officers hesitated, unsure whether to comply or resist. Their training told them they had jurisdiction over arrests, but these new arrivals carried a different kind of mandate, one that could overshadow local authority, and they seemed absolutely prepared to use it. Finally, the desk officer nodded reluctantly. "We'll bring her out." Two uniformed officers rushed to the holding cell. Brielle tensed as the gate swung open. They removed her from the cell and led her down the corridor, the eyes of the other detainees following her in astonishment. A wave of relief nearly buckled her knees. She wanted to collapse, to cry, to scream, but she held herself upright, pressing her lips together. Outside in the hallway, she found herself face to face with Special Agent Coleman. He was a tall man with close cropped hair. He studied her face with an expression that mixed concern and anger at the sight of her reddened wrists. "Miss Carter," he said softly, voice contrasting with the hard stare he'd given the officers. "Are you all right?" She swallowed back tears. I'm okay, I think," she managed. "How did you?" He gently guided her forward. The pass you carried flagged an urgent notification to a White House staff liaison when they ran your name. "We were informed that you might be in danger. We're here to ensure your safety." The officers who had arrested her stood behind them, stony-faced. Brielle risked a glance at the first officer who had manhandled her. He stared at the floor, jaw clenched, eyes downcast. It was a stark reversal of the power dynamic. Every muscle in her body still trembled with residual fear and rage, but something else flickered: vindication. "Let's go," Special Agent Coleman said, ushering her out of the station. But the lead officer called after them. "Wait, you can't just remove her from custody. We have procedures." "She's a suspect." Coleman whirled around, posture rigid with quiet fury. "Suspect for what, exactly?" The officer's words came out in a sputtering mess. L loitering. She matched A. She was suspicious. Coleman didn't let him finish. He handed the officer a card. If you have any formal charges, you can direct them to this legal counsel. Otherwise, I suggest you reconsider your stance, given that Miss Carter's detention was without just cause, and we have multiple grounds for a civil rights violation suit. Brielle's gaze swept over the stunned officers. She had spent the last few hours in fear, uncertain if anyone would believe her. Now she saw them stare back with something akin to dread. It wasn't just fear of a lawsuit. It was fear of the attention this case would draw, the chain of command that might come crashing down on them. The Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Department was no stranger to public scrutiny. The last thing they needed was a legal battle that hinged on racial profiling and excessive force. With that, Coleman turned on his heel and escorted Brielle out into the night air. A small motorcade of sleek black SUVs waited at the curb. The swirl of events left her breathless. Just hours ago, she'd been an anonymous figure walking down the street. Now, government vehicles and men with earpieces were whisking her away from a police station cell. As she settled into the back seat of one of the SUVs, she felt a tidal wave of emotions: relief, anger, exhaustion, and gratitude. She rubbed her wrists where the cuffs had chafed. Her pulse still pounded with adrenaline. It felt unreal, like a scene from a movie. But the gentle hum of the engine and the distant glow of city lights reminded her that this was real life, and she was in the middle of it. Out of the corner of her eye, she glimpsed Coleman speaking softly into a phone, presumably updating someone on her condition. She wondered who else was involved, who else had mobilized to protect her. It was a puzzle she'd have to piece together soon enough. For now, all she could do was let the wave of relief carry her. She was free from that cell, but she knew that freedom came with a cost. The events of the night were far from over, and the fallout was just beginning. 2 hours later, Brielle was seated in a quiet conference room in a secure government building just outside the heart of D.C. The windows were heavily tinted, the furniture sturdy and unadorned. A single lamp illuminated the room, casting long shadows on the walls. Across from her sat Special Agent Coleman and another agent named Rodriguez, both wearing solemn expressions. "What happened back there," Coleman said, "is unacceptable. I'm sorry you went through that." A tear escaped Brielle's eye, and she quickly brushed it away. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'm just in shock." Rodriguez leaned forward. "We contacted the White House liaison, who verified your involvement in the Civil Rights Advisory Group. That triggered an emergency alert in our system because you're on a list of individuals who might be at risk due to the high-profile nature of your work. That's why we arrived so quickly." Brielle swallowed. "I didn't know my name was on some watch protection list." Coleman offered a faint smile. "It's standard protocol for certain individuals working closely with White House initiatives. We monitor potential threats." She nodded, remembering how her mentor at the White House had insisted on it. At the time, she'd found it a bit overprotective, but now she was thankful. "So what happens now?" Coleman exchanged a glance with Rodriguez. "We want a formal statement from you about everything that happened tonight. We'll likely coordinate with federal authorities to open an internal review of the officers involved in your arrest. If you're willing, we can also facilitate you pressing charges." Brielle inhaled slowly. Part of her wanted to bury this night in the deepest recesses of her memory, to move on and never think about it again. But another part of her, stronger, steadier, knew that silence would only perpetuate the cycle of injustice. "Yes," she said, voice firm. "I want to give a statement." Rodriguez nodded, placing a digital recorder on the table. "Whenever you're ready." Brielle began recounting the evening from the start, her walk home, the initial stop by the officer, the escalation, the handcuffs, the cell. Her voice trembled at times, but she pushed through. Describing the details felt surreal. It was like hearing her own story from a distance, as if it were happening to someone else. Yet it also felt cathartic to say it aloud, to give voice to the injustice. When she finished, Coleman clicked off the recorder. "Thank you," he said gently. "We'll make sure this is taken seriously." She nodded, leaning back in her chair, exhaustion draping over her like a heavy blanket. Her shoulders ached, her wrists were red, and her eyes felt gritty from the emotional toll. But a new resolve had begun to blossom in her chest. It was the same resolve that led her to civil rights activism in the first place. She would not let this incident go unchallenged. A few days later, Brielle found herself in a flurry of meetings with attorneys, community leaders, and officials from the police department's Internal Affairs Division. Each meeting was a whirlwind of statements, documents, and expressions of concern. The non-profit where she worked also rallied behind her, providing legal support and media contacts. Her story hit the local news. Headlines read, "Civil rights worker claims brutality by DC METRO, Police Secret Service intervenes." Journalists flooded her inbox, requesting interviews. Community organizations marched in protest outside the precinct where she'd been held, chanting her name. It felt surreal, like she'd stumbled into a spotlight she never wanted. But she used that platform to speak about systemic issues, about accountability, about the deep-rooted biases that had nearly stripped her of her freedom. Meanwhile, the officers involved found themselves in the eye of a storm. Their names leaked to the press. The first officer, the one who had yanked her arm, faced scrutiny, not just from public opinion, but from an internal investigation. Multiple civilian complaints had surfaced, painting a picture of a cop with a history of racially charged encounters. The tension that had crackled in the air on that night now sparked in the form of public outrage. Brielle learned that one of the officers, the one who had rummaged through her bag and found her White House pass, had filed a report labeling her as uncooperative and combative. But that claim shattered once video footage from the squad car's dashboard camera surfaced, showing that she had never resisted. In fact, the footage captured the moment she was seized, along with her cries of, "I'm not resisting." Within the precinct, morale plummeted among those who sympathized with the officers, while others felt it was a necessary reckoning. A police captain went on record, stating that this sort of misconduct could not be tolerated. Some hailed him as progressive, while others accused him of throwing his rank-and-file officers under the bus to save face. Amid all the turmoil, Brielle leaned on her friends and colleagues. Tasha, who had returned from out of town, practically moved in with her for a week, refusing to let her go through this alone. They spent late nights, talking, crying, strategizing. Brielle's emotions swung like a pendulum. One moment she was furious at the system, the next moment she was grateful for the support. But overshadowing everything was the knowledge that the Secret Service had come to her rescue. She had met a handful of agents in the aftermath, each one polite but formidable. They had assured her of ongoing protection, albeit discreet. That knowledge was comforting yet nerve-wracking. She was a young activist, not a household name or a government official. Why did the White House see her as so important? She knew she had to get answers. A week after her arrest, Brielle received a call from her mentor, Dr. Marianne Watkins, a respected civil rights lawyer who had advised multiple presidents on social policy. Dr. Watkins had taken Brielle under her wing years ago, impressed by her dedication and aptitude. "Brielle," Dr. Watkins said, her voice warm yet concerned, "I've scheduled a meeting with someone who wants to meet you. He's asked to remain unnamed for now, but he's closely tied to the administration. He'd like to hear your story firsthand. Brielle felt her stomach flip. Will this be at the White House? In an office nearby, Dr. Watkins replied, High security. This is important, Brielle. They want to understand how something like this could happen to someone so close to their circle. They also want your perspective on what needs to change. A swirl of disbelief and gratitude filled Brielle. This was bigger than she realized. Thank you, Dr. Watkins. I'll be there. On the day of the meeting, Brielle arrived at a discreet government building just a short drive from the White House. Special Agent Coleman was there, meeting her at the entrance. He greeted her with a nod and led her through a maze of corridors, each guarded by armed personnel. Finally, they arrived at a small conference room. Inside stood Dr. Watkins, regal and composed, in a charcoal grey suit. Next to her was a tall man in his early 50s, silver streaks at his temples, wearing a crisp blue shirt and no tie. Despite his casual appearance, there was a gravity about him that made Brielle instinctively straighten her posture. Miss Carter, he said, offering a handshake. Thank you for coming. Brielle shook his hand, feeling a gentle firmness in his grip. He didn't introduce himself by name, but Dr. Watkins had mentioned he was a high-level government advisor, someone with the president's ear, known in DC circles as the shadow man for his behind-the-scenes influence. Rumor had it he'd navigated foreign policy crises, negotiated with global leaders, and orchestrated entire legislative campaigns without once stepping into the public spotlight. Over the next hour, Brielle recounted her experience in detail, how the officers stopped her, their aggressive behavior, her fear, and finally, the humiliating arrest. The man listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. Dr. Watkins asked clarifying questions, ensuring every point was documented. When she finished, the advisor leaned back in his chair, sighing. We've suspected that certain precincts in DC Shave not fully embrace the city's directives on de-escalation and unbiased policing. It's disheartening to see it manifest so blatantly with someone like you, who is under direct White House initiative. Brielle nodded, her throat tight. I'm not the only one this happens to, though. There are countless others without any connections or pass. They're the ones who get lost in the system. Dr. Watkins placed a gentle hand on Brielle's shoulder. That's why your voice is crucial, Brielle. This incident might ignite the reforms we've been pushing for. If the administration backs serious measures, we could see real change. The advisor looked at her, his eyes reflecting empathy and determination. We would appreciate your continued collaboration. Not just for your own justice, but for systemic reform. Our hope is to publicly address this incident in a way that spurs meaningful change within law enforcement agencies. Brielle swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the moment. She wasn't just an activist anymore. She was a central figure in a rapidly unfolding narrative, one that could reshape policing in the nation's capital. I'll do whatever it takes, she said quietly. A soft smile tugged at the advisor's lips. We appreciate that. We'll be in touch soon to coordinate a plan. When the meeting concluded, Dr. Watkins lingered for a moment to embrace Brielle. I'm so proud of you, she murmured. You could have been bitter or fearful, but instead you're channeling this into change. Brielle hugged her back, tears pricking her eyes. For the first time since her arrest, she felt a glimmer of hope that something constructive would arise from her trauma. Yet she was also acutely aware that the fight was just beginning. She would face media scrutiny, legal battles, and possibly retaliation from those who resented her for putting a spotlight on police misconduct. But she wasn't alone. She had allies, powerful allies, and she had her community. She wouldn't let fear silence her. As word spread about Brielle's ordeal, the media frenzy intensified. Local news stations ran segments featuring interviews with her co-workers, supporters, and legal representatives. The story rippled beyond DC, capturing national headlines. Prominent journalists and commentators weighed in, some framing it as yet another instance of racial bias within law enforcement, others questioning whether the Secret Service's involvement was an overreach of federal power. Brielle found herself thrust into the public eye. Her schedule overflowed with requests to speak at community forums, attend town halls, and join policy discussions on police reform. Though it was overwhelming, she felt an obligation to seize the moment. The injustice she endured wasn't an isolated event. She wanted to amplify the stories of those who never got a second chance, who were hurt, ignored, or worse. Late one evening, she sat on a couch in a modest green room at a major news studio. She was minutes away from a live interview with a national anchor who promised to highlight her story. Her stomach coiled with nerves. Dr. Watkins had spent hours coaching her on how to remain calm under intense questioning. Tasha was by her side, squeezing her hand. "You got this," her friend whispered. "Just be yourself." Brielle forced a small smile. The door opened and a production assistant beckoned her to follow. She stepped onto the set, lights glaring in her eyes. Across from her sat the anchor, a poised woman with a friendly demeanor. They exchanged greetings, and soon Brielle was live in front of millions of viewers. The anchor asked about the night of the arrest, the role of the Secret Service, and how Brielle felt about the officers involved. Brielle answered carefully, emphasizing that the problem wasn't just those individual cops, it was the broader system that allowed abuses of power to persist. She stressed that her story was shared by countless black women across the country who faced unjust scrutiny or aggression from law enforcement. The interview concluded with applause from the small studio audience. Afterward, her phone lit up with messages of support. But there were also trolls, online accusations that she was exaggerating, using her race as a shield, or exploiting her White House connections. The vitriol hurt, but she reminded herself that hateful remarks often emerged when real change was on the horizon. A day later, she was invited to testify before a special committee in the D.C. Council, which was investigating police misconduct. Cameras clicked and flashed as she took her seat at the witness table. City officials, activists, and journalists crowded the chamber. She spoke passionately about her arrest, detailing every demeaning moment. She highlighted how quickly suspicion fell on her, how she was never asked simple, clarifying questions, how officers leaped straight to force. While reading her prepared statement, her voice quivered with emotion, but behind the tremor lay steely resolve. When she finished, the committee members fired questions about policy improvements, accountability measures, and training deficiencies. Brielle answered to the best of her knowledge, drawing on her non-profit experience and the insights gained from working with the White House Advisory Group. At the end of the hearing, one council member declared that Brielle's testimony underscored the urgency for a complete overhaul of de-escalation training protocols. Another proposed that her story be included in a broader push for state-level reforms. The momentum was building, and she was at the center of it. While Brielle stepped deeper into the world of activism and policy reform, the officers who had arrested her found themselves facing the consequences of their actions. Internal Affairs compiled a report based on dashcam footage, witness accounts, and Brielle's testimony. The findings were damning. There was no probable cause to detain Brielle, and the use of force was deemed excessive. The first officer, Sergeant Peterson, was placed on administrative leave pending a formal hearing. Local news outlets dug into his past, unearthing multiple complaints lodged by citizens, most of whom were Black or Latino. Many of these complaints had been quietly dismissed, never leading to serious repercussions. But this time, the spotlight was too bright to ignore. Under mounting public pressure, the precinct had little choice but to act. As protests flared outside police headquarters, the department released a statement promising thorough disciplinary action. Sergeant Peterson's allies in the force felt betrayed by what they saw as a witch hunt, but others saw it as long overdue accountability. For Peterson, karma arrived swiftly. His name and face saturated the news cycle, with reporters camped outside his home for comment. His neighbors whispered behind closed doors, and his family endured a barrage of online harassment. His superiors, eager to distance themselves from controversy, offered no support. Before he knew it, official misconduct charges loomed on the horizon. Weeks later, Peterson appeared before a police review board. The hearing was tense, with both community members and fellow officers in attendance. Evidence was presented: the dashcam video, audio recordings, his history of complaints, even statements from the other officers at the scene who, under oath, confirmed that Peterson had escalated the situation unnecessarily. Brielle, wearing a modest blazer, took the stand. She recounted once more how Peterson had grabbed her arm, how fear had seized her when she realized the power he wielded over her. Her voice trembled slightly, but she maintained composure, determined not to be cowed by the uniform or the institution it represented. In his defense, Peterson claimed he'd acted on a tip about a suspect matching Brielle's description. He insisted he never intended to harm her, but each excuse crumbled when cross-examined. The review board ultimately recommended that Peterson be terminated from the force. Furthermore, they proposed criminal charges of assault and false imprisonment. The final decision would rest with the district attorney. Once a respected figure in his precinct, Peterson now trudged out of the hearing room in disgrace. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions he refused to answer. The once confident swagger in his step was replaced by the hunched shuffle of a man who'd lost everything. Karma had come for him, swift and unyielding. As the weeks rolled on, Brielle watched the city respond to her case with a mixture of hope and caution. D.C. Council members fast-tracked legislation aimed at mandating body cameras for all officers, establishing clear guidelines for stop and frisk encounters, and instituting a civilian oversight board with real enforcement power. A wave of optimism swept through communities that had long yearned for genuine accountability. Brielle became a central figure in these conversations, testifying at hearings, attending legislative sessions, and participating in public forums. Though exhausted, she was fueled by the conviction that real change was within reach. One evening, at a community gathering held in a local church, she spoke to a packed congregation that included residents, faith leaders, activists, and even some police officers. Standing at the pulpit, she scanned the sea of faces. This was her chance to bridge gaps, to speak not just about anger and injustice, but also about hope and healing. I stand before you, not just as a woman who experienced a brutal arrest, she began, voice echoing through the sanctuary, but as someone who believes in the power of community. That night, I felt alone, powerless. But I've learned that we're never truly alone if we stand up for each other. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. She recounted the fear she felt, the injustice she endured, and then the overwhelming support that had poured in from everyday citizens, from activists, and from officials who wanted to see genuine reform. Change doesn't come from a single event or a single voice, she said. It comes from all of us demanding better laws, better training, better accountability, and better relationships between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Scattered applause grew into a standing ovation. She spotted a few officers in the audience, heads bowed in thoughtful reflection. Perhaps, she mused, not all of them were like Peterson. There were those within the force who recognized the need for reform and were willing to fight for it from the inside. They, too, deserved support. In the following days, Brielle met with police captains who sought her input on new training modules emphasizing de-escalation and implicit bias awareness. The Department of Justice opened an inquiry into the Point DC Metropolitan Police Department, vowing to examine not just Brielle's arrest, but the broader patterns it represented. Meanwhile, her own life calmed slightly. She returned to her non-profit tasks, though her responsibilities now included leading workshops on civil rights in policing. She was recognized as a spokesperson, invited to conferences around the country to share her story and insights. Her relationship with the Secret Service detail also evolved. While they no longer whisked her off in black SUVs, they checked in periodically. They reminded her that her protective status remained in effect, urging caution in case anyone harbored ill will toward her. Brielle appreciated the concern, but she also grew more confident, less fearful. She believed that even though darkness lurked in some corners, the collective effort for progress would outshine it. Dr. Watkins watched Brielle's rise with pride. "You've come a long way," she said one day, her hand resting gently on Brielle's arm. "I remember when you were just a passionate grad student who wanted to change the world." Brielle smiled. "I still am. Now I just have a platform I never expected." They both laughed, recalling simpler times, but they also knew there was no going back. Brielle's life had changed forever. She carried scars, both physical and emotional, but those scars had shaped her into someone stronger, more influential. A month after the DC Council hearing, Brielle received a phone call from a number she didn't recognize. The voice on the other line was distinctly familiar, though Special Agent Coleman. "Brielle," he said, "someone very important wants to speak with you. We can't say who over the phone, but please come to the secure facility where we first debriefed you after your arrest." She felt a flutter of nerves. What now? Another crisis? Curiosity gnawed at her throughout the ride. When she arrived, Coleman greeted her with a respectful nod, leading her down the hallway to a large conference room guarded by 2 more agents. Inside waited the tall, silver-templed advisor she'd met before, and sitting beside him, in a simple yet commanding posture, was the President of the United States. Brielle's heart nearly burst from her chest. She froze, unsure whether to kneel, bow, or run. The President, her country's leader, looked up from a stack of papers and stood, extending a hand. "Miss Carter," the President said, "it's an honor." Words failed her. She stammered a greeting, and they both sat. The President's eyes brimmed with empathy. "I've followed your story closely, and I want to personally thank you, not only for handling your ordeal with dignity, but for inspiring a movement toward reform." Brielle's mouth felt dry. "Thank you, Mr. President," she managed. "I'm humbled." They spoke for over an hour. The President asked about her background, her motivations, her hopes for police reform. She spoke candidly, somewhat in a daze, but determined to make every word count. She told him about community-led initiatives, about bridging the gap between the public and the police, and about ensuring accountability measures had real teeth. When she finished, he let out a thoughtful sigh. "You remind me of the young activists who paved the way in decades past," he said quietly. "People like you push us to do better. Because of your courage, we have a chance to enact meaningful change, not just in DC, but across the country." Brielle felt tears prick her eyes. Everything she'd endured, every humiliating moment in that jail cell, every hateful comment online, every fear-laden memory, was it all leading here, to this pivotal opportunity? The President offered a small smile. "I want you to know you have my administration's support. We'll be rolling out new federal guidelines for local police departments who receive certain grants. Your testimony and your experience will be part of our rationale." Brielle's heart soared. This was the kind of systemic approach she had dreamed of. I can't thank you enough," she said softly. He rose, signaling the end of the meeting. "Your mentor, Dr. Watkins, speaks very highly of you. Stick to your principles, Miss Carter. This country needs voices like yours." Then, with a firm handshake, the president left the room. Brielle remained in her seat, stunned. The silver-templed advisor walked over, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Keep going, Brielle," he said. "You've got powerful allies, but the real power comes from your community and your own unwavering passion." She nodded, overcome by a wave of gratitude and determination. Everything had changed from that fateful night on the street, but she would channel the pain into progress. In the following weeks, Brielle witnessed a transformation in DC's policing culture. The new oversight board launched. Body cameras became mandatory for all patrol officers, not just a select few. Training reforms were implemented citywide, focusing on de-escalation techniques, cultural competency, and mental health awareness. Many officers openly embraced the new policies, eager to rebuild trust with the communities they served. Within the non-profit world, Brielle continued her work, but on a larger scale. She traveled to other cities, consulted with grassroots organizers, shared her story, and listened to the stories of others who lacked the high-profile support she'd received. She lobbied for state and federal lawmakers to adopt similar reforms, forging connections and alliances in the process. Her personal life also found a steadier rhythm. She and Tasha moved into a slightly bigger apartment, where Brielle converted the living room corner into a makeshift office with shelves of policy books and stacks of legal documents. Some nights she dreamed of the jail cell, reliving the terror, but each time she recalled the moment the Secret Service arrived, how it symbolized a turning point, not just for her, but for countless others seeking justice. The day Sergeant Peterson's trial began, the city braced for potential unrest. But protests remained largely peaceful, with many rallying outside the courthouse, holding signs that read "Justice for All" and "Black Women Matter." The trial served as a testament that the system could at least sometimes hold even its own enforcers accountable. He eventually pled guilty to charges of misconduct and received a prison sentence, though some felt it was too lenient. Regardless, the verdict sent a resounding message: unchecked abuse would no longer be protected by silence and complacency. Brielle quietly visited the courtroom the day Peterson was sentenced. She watched him stand before the judge, saw the regret etched into his face. Part of her felt pity for him, a man undone by his own prejudice and misuse of power. Part of her felt a surge of relief. The system, flawed as it was, had shown that change was possible when enough people demanded it. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for a statement, but she offered only a measured response. "This is one step toward healing. We have more work to do." As autumn leaves turned golden in the nation's capital, Brielle strolled once more near the National Mall. This time, she felt no apprehension. The city lights shimmered, and the nightly hum of traffic wove through her ears like a comforting lullaby. She thought about how quickly life had pivoted, how adversity had thrust her into a role of leadership she never sought, but ultimately embraced. The wind tugged at her jacket. She paused, gazing up at the Washington Monument. She recalled Dr. Watkins's words: "You could have been bitter or fearful, but instead you're channeling this into change." Yes, the night of her arrest had been harrowing, a painful testament to the racial biases that still plagued society. But it also ignited a chain reaction that forced a reckoning, one that reverberated through the halls of power. She had discovered her own resilience, backed by a community and a coalition of unlikely allies. Even the president had affirmed her belief in justice. In the soft glow of the city, Brielle Carter vowed to continue the fight. She would remain vigilant, holding the line for those who came after her, because the struggle for civil rights and equality was never just about one person's story. It was about all of us together, demanding a world where dignity and respect were the baseline, not the exception. And so, with her chin held high, she walked forward into the night, ready to face whatever challenges awaited her next. Every journey has the power to reshape lives, and Brielle Carter's story proves just that. From a solitary stroll, where she found herself handcuffed in a dingy holding cell, to standing before legislators, law enforcement leaders, and even the president, her transformation was nothing short of extraordinary. The night she faced brutality became the catalyst for profound change, proving that one person's courage, combined with the might of community support, can spark a revolution in how society confronts injustice. If this story inspired you, let's keep pushing forward. Share it with someone who needs hope. Engage in conversations about justice and fairness. Spread it far and wide so that more voices can be heard. Your voice matters. And together, we can continue to demand a system that respects every individual's rights. Remember to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss future stories that shine a light on truth and perseverance.